G'day folks, thank you all very much for coming. My name is Simon. It's a tremendous pleasure and a great privilege that I have to have a conversation this afternoon with Daniel James. Daniel is a Yorta Yorta Melbourne-based writer and broadcaster. He hosts The Mission on 3RRR, and in 2018 he won the Horn Prize for his beautiful essay 10 More Days. As Nick just mentioned, Daniel has just also finished writing a book on William Cooper, whose photo you can see just up here, and that's going to form the substance of our conversation this afternoon. I'm going to hand over actually now to Daniel.
Thank you, Simon. First of all, I'd like to say what an honour and a pleasure it is to have been invited here to speak with you all. And as agreed with Simon, I'd just like to acknowledge the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nation, whose land we meet on today, and pay my respects to their elders, past and present. And just remember that wherever I go.
Thank you, Daniel. So Daniel, you've, I understand, just submitted or about to submit a manuscript of a book that you have just written. Before we commence this conversation, can you tell us a little bit about this book?
So, you have to search for it, but there actually has been a fair bit written about William Cooper. Anthony Bain put out a biography last year about him, and he's done tremendous work throughout the years, looking at the correspondence that he wrote throughout his life. Most of it, in a formal sense, has been captured because it was written to governments, or he had written a lot of letters to the Argus and the Age and to various other daily newspapers. And it's fantastic work, and it's so helpful, and it's been really great in terms of being able to capture his story. But as kind of like him being my great uncle, the brother of my great grandmother, I thought that there was an opportunity to take the work that had been done by Bain and by several other historians, both family and non-family, and actually really sort of paint the picture as vividly as possible as to the life and times that he actually lived in and what he had to get through to even get to the point of being a wonderful advocate for his people and for other people as well. And so what I wanted to do was, for instance, in one of the biographies, there's a line about, I'm not giving anything away because it's on the public record, of course. His first wife, Annie, died of typhoid at Cummeragunja Mission, and then 9 days later, his youngest son died of the same thing as an infant. That's one line in a book. So I wanted to take that line and turn it into something more vivid, knowing not only the story of my own people, but reading about that time period more broadly, the pressures that were on the Yorta Yorta people as they tried to survive the decimation of colonisation. And so what I've tried to do is take the facts that we know and then to explore the story within those facts, those letters, those speeches that he gave, and try and make it a work of literature as much as anything else.
In as much as you are looking at his personal life, I'm wondering, given that he was the brother of your great-great-grandmother, did you grow up with stories about him?
We grew up with stories. We were always conscious of him because that photo of him would be adorned on places like Rumballara, which is I guess, an Aboriginal cultural gathering place in Shepparton. So we see his photos a lot, and we knew that he was related to us. But the stories I grew up with were more sort of related to my great-grandfather, Thomas James, who basically was the school teacher at Maloga Mission and at Cummeragunja Mission. And he was the person that helped William read and write. Apparently a phenomenal learner too, by the way, picked things up really quickly. He's the one that educated people like Sir Doug Nicholls and Margaret Tucker, and a whole swathe of Aboriginal activists that came out of that. And so William's story sort of fell within that context for me. It wasn't front and centre. But then as I've gotten older and I've worked in Aboriginal affairs in and out and around and about throughout the years, his story for me personally has become more prominent, but I'm very glad to see that within the broader community it's becoming more prominent as well. So it just seemed like it was given the type of writing I'm doing at the moment, it just seemed like, well, there's a story that needs to be really told. And we've got a long way to correcting the history of this country. And I think one of the ways we correct the history of this country is by trying to tell our story as evocatively and as passionately as possible.
Absolutely. And I think William Cooper is somebody that we speak about here within the local Jewish community, certainly. But when we do, oftentimes his life gets condensed to one particular moment, that march to the German consulate and his protestation. What other things would you wish more people knew about William Cooper?
I think if we look at his life as a whole, he was born 1859, 1860, we don't know exactly. It is rumoured that he was born at the junction of the Goulburn and Murray River, or the Dungala River, Murray River, or Kyalla River, as the Yorta Yorta people call it. There are other rumours that he was born on Moira Station, which I think is probably more likely, because if you look at the people that grew up on Kamaragunja, they have the names of Briggs, James, not so much James, but Muir, Cooper, Atkinson. These are all surnames of labourers that worked at Moira Station. And so there was a lot of, impregnation of young Aboriginal girls as young as 14 or 15 at the time, which was a common practice. So he was born into a time where, the decimation of colonization was at its peak. He has one vivid memory of his people, who he describes as the Maori people, which would have been a corroboree, and maybe it was the last corroboree that we know of. So that would have been a meeting of different tribes, the Bangarang, Wavaroo, Yorta Yorta, Tanarong, at a junction, probably somewhere like the Goulburn and Murray Rivers. And that was his first recollection of his own culture, but it was also really the last. And so he was born in a time when the last swathes of traditional culture as we knew it were kind of like in the final spark. They're beginning to burn out and die out through things like smallpox in the main. And so that's where he came from. He came from a world where he was a half-caste, where he was trying to cling on to what traditional culture that he could, and he could only do that through his mother, Kitty. But then he had to go to work, and then he had to work out, well, where does he stand in the world? Where does he find himself? And so he started from that very, very, very low base, and through some deep-seated commitment to social justice, goes on to become the first secretary of the Australian Aborigines League. He was involved in establishing the Day of Mourning, which was set for Australia Day in 1938, which was the 150th anniversary of the arrival of First Fleet at Sydney Cove. And so he was aware then that Australia Day was a problem then, and we're still having the same argument now. He petitioned the King. He actually organised 8,500 signatures asking for there to be Aboriginal representation within the federal parliament. And so with acts like that, we wouldn't have been able to get to the 67 referendum, and we definitely wouldn't be talking about things like the Uluru Statement from the Heart, like we are now, if it wasn't for him and some of his contemporaries. And to think that he did all that coming from, being born in the bush, not being treated as a citizen, having limited attachment to his own culture, he and his contemporaries basically gave birth to what it means to be sort of a modern Aboriginal person. And I think all of us kind of follow in those footsteps.
Thank you. Look, I think for myself, something that I find so remarkable and, to be honest, so humbling about him is, as you've described, coming from this background of tremendous suffering and tremendous personal suffering as well. You mentioned his wife, his two wives that he had lost, and all of his local communal activism. I just find so humbling that he has become so well known for speaking out so passionately on behalf of another persecuted people. And I'm curious, are there other instances in which he was involved in social justice on behalf of other communities, the way he was in this one instance?
He was. He obviously had a presence about him because he was a delegate for the Australian Workers' Union. And you think of sort of like a half-caste Aborigine becoming a significant leader within the Australian Workers' Union movement. He obviously had a presence about him. He would have represented. He represented, in terms of other nations, he represented, Northern Territory Aboriginal people. He represented Western Australian Aboriginal people, who at that time were kind of at their first point. 50 years later, they were kind of at their first point of first contact, and so they were suffering like the Yorta Yorta and Wathaurong and Boonwurrung and all the Victorian tribes had suffered. So he was a great advocate for them. I think the fact that the march to the German consulate that happened December 6, 1938, I think that is it's still something that we really struggle to get our head around. I know that at the time there was a lot of political activism in and around Melbourne. We're coming out of the Great Depression. We have a generation of Australians that are still reeling from World War I and the loss of so many through that conflict. And then we've got the prospect of war again in Europe. And he was an avid reader, and I think he was... the Australian Aborigines League was being coerced in all sorts of directions. Well, I know the Communist Party was big at the time, and they were trying to coerce the Aborigines League to their point of view as well. But he was a tremendous reader, and in my research, I often thought, as a layperson, thinking, well, how did he even hear about the persecution of Jewish people in Europe in 1936, 1937, 1938? Well, the Argus, remarkably, did some really, really sort of in-depth reporting of the events that were occurring there at the time. And I can just imagine him sitting around with his other contemporaries in the Australian Aborigines League saying, this is not good enough. There are reports of people coming from Europe and coming to Darwin where they were escaping persecution, and the Argus was there on the ground interviewing these people who were giving really vivid and telling stories of what was happening there at the time. And so, there wasn't, in terms of publicity for the Australian Aborigines League, there wasn't a tremendous amount of publicity. There's like a paragraph about that big in the Argus the following day. So this is just a simple, straight-up case of, well, the standard you walk past is the standard you accept. And I think that's what they did. And they were tremendously poor people. He was a retired shearer by this stage. The reason they marched, I'm assuming, from Footscray to Collins Street was because not all of them could afford the train fare. So they marched, they walked, and he was approaching... he was about 78, 79 at the time. And so they led a delegation there, and the Germans wouldn't have a bar of them. But they made their point. They just did it because it was the right thing to do. And you just see so little of that, either now or in our history. And so it's just absolutely remarkable.
Well, I think it bespeaks a profound empathy and compassion to be able to recognise somebody else's suffering in spite of one's own, and for somebody who at that time would have been accounted an elderly man, for him to have undergone that it's a huge thing.
It's a massive thing. You know, I think what he saw was, you know, just a number of parallels. You know, just the broader community beginning to attack and beset themselves on a minority. He would have seen lots of parallels with that and his own people and the story of his old people as well. And why not do something about it? It wasn't going to hurt anyone. It was just going to make a point. And that's what he did. I would have loved to have seen the petition. That's the things that we've lost. So we've actually lost the words of the petition to the German consulate, and we lost a lot of other things as well. But, you know, I was just thinking about it in a really practical sense, you know, walking from Southampton Street to Footscray to Collins Street. They've gone there, they've handed the petition to the I guess the clerk that met them at the German consulate. Didn't want a bar of it, handed it back. And then what do? They go off for a spot of lunch, you know, catch some of them catch the train home. What then, you know? It's just that sort of that day-to-day, we think about the big moments, but we don't think about the hours preceding or what that meant for their week. What did they have to do to rearrange their week? Who had to take time off work? It was a Tuesday. It wasn't, it was a middle of the week, and that's a whole day gone. It's just little things, little practicalities like that you sort of just wonder about.
Are those some of the things that you've sought to address in your book?
Yeah, I've tried to address these sorts of things. His house at Southampton Street in Footscray, which is also the headquarters of the Australian Aborigines League, which was sold probably about 3 weeks ago. We were talking about capital, having financing for buying a place. If I had financing approval to buy a place, I would have tried to buy it, because it's actually a significant piece of Australian history when you think about it. But yeah, that's what I've tried to address in the book. It's just, okay, well, he lost his first wife to typhoid. He lost his second wife, who they had 5 children, to tuberculosis. They're lines in a book, but there's no story in and around that. And why, after working for 50, 60 odd years as a shearer, a rouseabout, and even a fishmonger, why at the end of his life did he decide to move to Melbourne, where he was comfortably living in Yarrawonga at the time, to move to Melbourne, to the industrial heartland of Melbourne, being Footscray at the time, and start this entire movement? It's fascinating to think about. Just the level of motivation the fellow must have had to try and fix things that he saw as not just. Quite incredible.
I think those are wonderful questions to ask, and I don't wish to preempt anything that is in your book, but are those questions that you've been able to answer?
I think he always had a strong sense of what was wrong and what was right. I think as he got older and older, he got more and more impatient. I don't think he got angry as such, although there are a couple of passages in the book where he gets angry because it's expected that Aborigines signed up and go and fight in Europe again. And having given a son to that cause in World War I, he was very, very, very strongly coming out saying, we're not even counted as citizens yet in our own country. Why should we go and fight for a country that doesn't even recognise us? So there was that, but there's also always the diplomatic aspect of him. He was never a radical. He was never someone that was going to, chain himself to a fence or anything. He would try and use the white man's bureaucracy and the white man's use of letters and words to try and put forward their cause. So I think I think he just saw, he had children of his own. He saw children coming off the mission at Kamargunja, and he thought, well, here's a chance to not only just build a legacy, but here is a chance to actually instill a movement into future generations. And if it wasn't going to be him, then who else was it going to be? Because everyone else had pretty much gone. You know, his brothers and sisters had passed away. Some of his good friends, some of his lifelong friends had passed away. And so it's him instilling that form of leadership into people like Sir Doug Nicholls and Margaret Tucker to carry it forward once he'd gone. And so I think that's, in many ways, just as much of a part of his great legacy as anything else, was that selflessness at the end of his life when he should have been retired, enjoying his grandchildren. He was putting himself in harm's way in terms of the impact that it had on his own physical health, but also harm's way in a societal, social sense as well.
You mentioned a little while ago some questions over precisely when and where he was born. In the course of researching, did you find, were there other areas as well that there were some question marks hanging over the traditional account of his life and legacy?
Yeah, there's a whole bunch of grey areas that sort of emerged throughout the research. For instance, there are people in William's family and my family that would have sworn black and blue that Kitty, his mother, died at Maloga Mission in 1885. And then the Bayonet book comes along and says, no, it was 1900. And I thought, well, need to get this bit of the story right. This is pretty important. And it turns out, yeah, she passed away at Kamargunja Mission in 1900, and my grandfather was one of the people that was the witnesses to her death certificate, which we were able to track down. And so there's all these sort of anomalies that exist. Like I said, we don't know when he was born. We think we know when he was born. We don't know what month he was born. We know very little or anything about his father, except that he had nothing to do with him. So what we can work out was that he was John Cooper, I think his name was a labourer on Moira Mission. He had 4 children with Kitty, and there's another fellow called Atkinson that had another 3 children with her as well. And so trying to think about, you know, her life story and the tensions at play for her, and, you know, what she did to survive and produce these kids that all went on to thrive in their own particular way. It's just things you can really, really sort of ruminate on in a deep way.
This father of his, he would be your shared ancestor with William Cooper?
Yeah, yep. So he would be. So William's mother is my shared ancestor with him, and so John Cooper would be my shared ancestor with him as well. So it's a lot of moving parts to the story, but hopefully I've been able to pull it together in some sort of coherent fashion, because it's a story that needs to be shared, I would suggest.
Thank you. Look, I'd love in just a moment actually to give members of our audience an opportunity to ask questions as well. But just before handing over to other people for their questions, I wanted to ask Daniel, having done all of this research into this important man, how do you think we could best transmit his legacy today?
Look, I think the obvious answer is to get behind the Uluru Statement for the Heart. He was calling for seats for Aboriginal people to be assigned in the Parliament back in the 30s, back in the 40s. He was talking about Aboriginal people being counted as citizens, which we got there eventually through the 1967 referendum. The Statement from the Heart, even though it doesn't seem like it's a particularly practical step to fix some of the issues that we're confronting at the moment, and I'll be very explicit here, if we have a voice at the heart of our Australian democracy, then there's a greater chance that decision makers, bureaucrats, clerks, the broader population will start treating some Aboriginal people like human beings. We see a case that's going on at the moment at the Coroner's Court with another Yorta Yorta woman called Veronica Nelson, who was left to basically die in her cell in a pool of her own vomit, and there's an inquest into that at the moment. But I would suggest to you that if she wasn't seen as a second-class citizen or someone lower than your average citizen, then she would still be alive today. And I think having a voice at the heart of our democracy enables a more complex and a more authoritative conversation to have about the place of First Nations people in this country. And so that goes a long way to rectifying a lot of these issues.
Thank you.
15 minutes. Yep. Any questions?
Yes. Oh, hold on a second. I'm so sorry. Have a microphone.
Quick.
Many years ago, there was a series called The First Australians, and the Victorian episode of that was such an eye-opener for me personally. I still carry it with me. Is it still relevant, or are there changes to the story since then? No,
I remember seeing that story too, and it spoke specifically about the tussle of the people at Corandurk. Yeah. The Wurundjeri people in particular, and William Barak. I could talk a lot about this, but I'll try and keep it down to a soundbite. What was happening in Australia, and one of the reasons that people at Kamargunja thrived for so long was they were on the other side of the border. The Victorian powers that be decided that they would come up with an act called the Half-Caste Act, which was an act that was designed to keep half-castes away from their full-blooded mothers, fathers, aunties, sometimes sisters, with the idea that the Aborigine race was dying out, and so we'll let the full-bloods die out on their own with no more sort of interbreeding with the general population, and then we will let the half-castes just basically breed into the population over time. And that had obviously a devastating impact on the Aboriginal population here. One example I like to sort of cite in terms of how immediate that sort of impact was that we all are well aware of the story of Ned Kelly. And a lot of us are aware of the story that there were black trackers brought down from Queensland to hunt him through the Strathbogie Ranges up into the Alpine areas. Well, I would put it to you that the Tanarong people would have known that landscape within a twig. But by 1878, 1879, there weren't any left. There weren't any left to do that. So we had to ship people down from Queensland to do that. And so we're losing entire tribes, entire clans, entire families and family lines within the space of about 20 years, through slaughter, through illness, and through things like the Half-Caste Act. From my perspective, we had three things. We had the initial point of evasion, we had disease, and then we had the clerks. And the clerks did as much damage as anyone else in terms of wiping out our people down here. So that story in First Australians is still very relevant.
Thank you.
Yes, hi. I know quite a bit about the story, but the one thing I haven't quite figured out. So in his lifetime, it's possible to say that William Cooper didn't achieve many of the things that he set out to do, and he died probably upset with himself and with life and with who knows what.
Yep.
But since then, a lot of the things that we're still talking about, they've become a lot better known. He himself, his name has become better known. Uncle Boydie, his grandson, used to say that at one point he was better known sometimes overseas than he was known in his own country. But I think a lot of that is changing. So given the research that you've done and as much as you know about him, what do you think he would have made of the fact that now these things are coming to bear 80 years after the fact that he started first talking about them?
I actually had the privilege of sitting on a panel with his great-great-granddaughter, and I actually did a story for Radio National with Uncle Boydie last year talking about another aspect of the Yorta Yorta story, and that's the flats at Marupna. Look it up, Daniel James, Radio National, you'll find it. And they both said very particularly that he would be flabbergasted. He would be absolutely sort of blown away by the recognition that he's beginning to get. And I firmly believe that we're still at the beginning of getting his story out and about. We have the William Cooper Justice Centre in their legal district. We have the William Cooper Centre out at Monash as well. I think Richmond, the Richmond Tigers are going to have a William Cooper Centre as well. And so I think that's fantastic, but I just don't want his name to be used as a stamp or as a label to say, listen, we're all up and about around Aborigines here. We know our stuff around Aborigines. I want to make sure that okay, you're going to use his name, know the man. So that's what I'm sort of trying to do here. But he would have been flabbergasted. He was a rouseabout and a shearer, a fishmonger, had a tiny little shack at Barmer, which he lived in at the end, died in Marupna, and died, like you said, a very frustrated man because not getting anywhere near anything that he wanted to achieve. But look where we are now.
Thank you. Yes, please.
Just wondering what the title of your book is and when we can expect to hopefully read it, and as well as that, any other books or podcasts or sort of TV shows that you would recommend to learn more about the life and work of William Cooper and people adjacent to him around that time in history?
I would recommend the Bain Atwood book, which came out last year. It was not entitled a biography, but it was kind of like a history of William Cooper. I think that's a really good starting point. Bain Atwood's also done some work around publishing his letters. So if you just Google him, Bain Atwood and William Cooper, you'll come up with all his works, which are all still readily available. Sorry, what was the other part of your question?
Also, any other media about him and his life, and also tell us a bit more about your book when you can expect to.
So, Nick was saying that it's kind of like, it's kind of weird that this has come about the way it has today, because I'm actually submitting the manuscript to my publisher tomorrow. And so this is kind of like pre, I guess, publicity for it. It's got a working title at the moment. It's called Man of Words, just because I just saw him as a person that tried to use the systems that oppressed him back the other way. And so he was a prolific writer, prolific speech giver, so Man of Words, but as a working title, the publisher might think of something else. In terms of other works that sort of like highlight his life or highlight the story of his life, there's a wonderful book that you can get through the State Library of Victoria by Margaret Tucker, Auntie Margaret Tucker. It's called If They Knew. And it paints a very, written by her in the first person, it paints a very, very vivid picture of what life was like in and around the time that William Cooper was doing a lot of his things. And she actually went on to become a member of the Australian Aborigines League. I reckon, and there's another book as well written by an uncle with the help of someone called Reminiscences of Cummeragunja. So there are a whole bunch of other books, but I point you to those two because those two are written by people who were there in the first person. I just remember vividly in Margaret's book saying that there was an auntie that was on the veranda at Cummeragunja, and all she would do all day is just cry, and she would be surrounded by other aunties and other women, but she was just crying for the children that she lost. She lost 4 or 5 children, and there's no amount of academia, there's no amount of anthropological or historical fiction that can paint a picture like that than a first-hand account. So my advice is to try and go to the sources. And if you go to those two books, heaps of things will leap out at you.
Thank you. Do we have another question for Daniel?
I
We
do,
have
if
one
I'm
just over
allowed
here.
to.
Oh, sorry.
Can I ask a question? Well, it's actually a statement a bit. I work at the Melbourne Holocaust Museum, and Uncle Boydie came there and he told us, and I think everybody would be thrilled to know this, that at the commemoration of the Light Horse Brigade at Beersheba, there was a ceremony and Uncle Boydie was invited to go to Israel and to accept the petition from the German ambassador at Yad Vashem. So that's the end of the circle. And the Israeli embassy where? The Israeli embassy in Germany. Yes, so that's the circle turn.
Yeah, and he also met with Prince William as well, who the Australian Aborigines League had organised a petition to the King, asking for better treatment of Aboriginal people, but also seats to be set aside in the Australian Parliament. And the Prime Minister at the time, I don't know whether it was, can't remember the name of the Prime Minister, but refused to forward it on to the King. And so Uncle Boydie had a chance then to meet with Prince William. I think it was during maybe the last Commonwealth Games, and provide him with a new rehashed.
Yeah, I think it was around 217, 218.
That sounds about right. Yeah. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of circles that come with the story, but I'll tell you a quick anecdote. He and Sir Doug Nicholls were involved in a speech at Melbourne Cemetery. And I think it was like on the 100th anniversary of John Batman's death or passing. And they were there as the Australian Aborigines League to celebrate John Batman, who was known to be a person that treated Aborigines well when he founded Melbourne. And so they're all there and they're all lauding him. And then, obviously, as time goes on and more of history is revealed, we find out that John Batman was basically a syphilitic Tasmanian and a mass murderer in Tasmania at the time, and didn't really treat Aborigines here any better than he did in Tasmania. But it's just so ironic that thinking of William Cooper standing at John Batman's grave and then having the federal seat of Batman changed to Cooper, about 6 or 7 years ago, William not knowing what he didn't know, we knowing more than William did then, and then to have Batman's name replaced with William Cooper. Now, if there's anything that I would suggest be a head explode for William, it would be the fact that he has a federal seat named after him now.
That's amazing.
It's weird.
It is weird.
Never moves in straight lines, history.
Thank you for sharing that. That's a remarkable anecdote. We had a question over here. Did you still have a question that you'd like to ask?
Sorry, that's been a really interesting conversation that we've had. Knowing how the Aboriginal people have been treated so appallingly and so little has been done from a federal level, or should I say, not successfully done, would it be better if much more was done from within the Aboriginal community themselves, rather than relying on constant government intervention, which never seems to go anywhere? What are your thoughts on that?
Well, we have a really interesting moment in history here in Victoria at the moment around the treaty process, and so we have our own Victorian treaty. I forget what the First Peoples Assembly of Victoria, who are the elected bodies from the remaining tribes and clans that we have about the place. It's going to be their job to be tasked with negotiating a treaty with the state government, which I'm pleased to say that you would think, okay, well, that's going to be very, very lopsided. We have the all the resources that the Crown has at its disposal to negotiate on behalf of the government. But they're actually putting together a commission that will even it up and make sure that there is enough resources financially and legalistically to make sure that we're able to negotiate the treaty on an equal footing. And so that will be a really interesting experiment to see how that happens and how actually outcomes might be improved out of that. There's the Uruk Justice Commission that's going around at the moment speaking to mainly elders about the place in terms of getting their story of dispossession and all the challenges that people have faced facing systems in the main, education system, justice system, health system, all had our challenges with them. So what falls out of the treaty process, that will be a real litmus test in terms of what you're talking about. Because it's an opportunity for the first time in the history of this state in particular for Aboriginal people to be on the same footing as the Crown in terms of negotiating outcomes. So we'll see what happens.
Thank you. Daniel, I suspect that were we able to prevail upon your time for longer, we would have a number of other questions to be asked of you. I want to thank you very much for speaking so openly about the work that you've been engaged in. I know it can't be easy when you're about to submit a manuscript to comment upon that manuscript that you have just written, but I'm sure I speak for everybody.
People here now know more about my transcript than my publisher. I just wanted to reiterate before we finish up what an honour it was to be invited here and get to speak with you all today, because the stories of our communities are intertwined and add to the rich history of this place that we call Australia, and I think I'm very proud of that. So it's good. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. Thank you, folks.